A lot of the issues that people face with time management is it can be solved with just like 30 minutes at the start of the week or over the weekend or at the end of the last week to think about like, what do I need to do this week? In big buckets, not like, here are my 20 tasks this week, but just like, what are the most important things for me to juggle? Quick look at the calendar. Do I, broadly speaking, have the time to do that? And I think it's really important in assessing that to be very brutally honest with yourself, both in terms of what commitments do you have that you can't break. And so making sure that you're looking at not just work, but also personal. If you have to pick up the kids from school at 3:00 on Wednesday, like that's not magically going to go away just because it's not on your work calendar. And so the biggest one is just that intentionality of trying to plan out, but there are much, much deeper issues that arise from there.
Welcome to Software Snack Bites. I'm your host, Shomik Ghosh of Bold Start Ventures, and today we're excited to have Matt Martin on the pod. Matt is the co-founder and CEO of Clockwise, and previously was at Salesforce after the RelateIQ acquisition. In this episode, we're going to cover tips for all of us looking to manage our time better. I think certainly in work and also, frankly, at home as well, and also cover some unique aspects of Clockwise's product and go-to-market. So, Matt, thanks for coming on and welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. This will be fun.
So, Matt, why don't you talk about what does Clockwise actually do for customers?
Yeah, absolutely. So Clockwise connects to your company's calendar system, and it helps you and all your colleagues get a better schedule. And the way that we do that is we're actually connecting to your calendar to understand how you meet, when you meet, what are your preferences, and we learn from the data underneath your calendar to help provide you with a more optimized schedule. And we have a rich suite of features around that. Some of them are focused exclusively on helping you as an individual. Some of them are helping, better schedule times between you and your teammates. We're really popular for managing one-on-ones and kind of those one-off meetings. But we help thousands of companies with millions of hours of time working with some great companies like Netflix, Uber, Atlassian, and best-of-breed software companies.
That's a pretty impressive list of customers, to say the least.
We've been lucky. We work with some really great people.
I want to ask you and I call it the Hacker News comment, right? Which is basically an individual would read it. Let's just say it's an engineer, and they just be like, yeah. Clockwise, like I can just block off my calendar. What's the deal? Why do I need software to do it for me? So how do you kind of address those comments from those sort of folks?
So I'm very familiar with the Hacker News style comment, and there's some truth to that, right? I mean, like you can do a lot of what we do manually, and part of the core value is that with manual intervention, you have to think about it, you have to plan that out, you have to be diligent about it. We'll do it automatically, but there's a lot of things that we do that you just can't do manually. And I'll take a step back, Shomik. So we were, myself and my co-founders, we were at a company called RelateIQ that was then acquired by Salesforce. I was heading up our front-end engineering team. And a consistent complaint that I got was, Matt, like there's just not enough time in the day. I'm taking my work home with me. I'm not able to get it done. There are too many distractions. And I'm a software engineer. And I would look at their schedule, and it looked like there was time. Like it looked like, relative to me as a manager, it looked like it was a pretty nice schedule. But what you realize, and hopefully this is resonant to a lot of the folks that listen to this, not just software engineers, but anybody who's in knowledge work where you need chunks of time to go heads down and just think, is often you're not in control of your own schedule. In a modern organization, people are scheduling with you. They're scheduling a sync. They're scheduling a project debrief. They're scheduling, a team meeting, a company meeting. And as, the person who's not organizing that, you don't necessarily have the ability, even if you have the social capital, which you don't always have, you don't have the ability to move the time of that meeting. Whereas Clockwise, looking across everybody's schedule, looking across everybody's availability, and critically looking across everybody's preferences, we can help open up that time where previously you might have had like a chunked out 30 minutes. Now we move that meeting and you have a beautiful 2 hours to go heads down on some meaty work.
That makes a lot of sense. And frankly, I want to talk a lot about the tips with navigating that between teams a little bit later. But what are some of the most technically challenging aspects of the product? And I'm guessing the basics are, you have to ingest calendar data across a number of different individuals. You have to then start to map time slots, but also I think you ingest preferences as well, or you have people put in their preferences. So you're now starting to train or trying to get in preferences, and then you have to build an algorithm that goes over all of that to kind of determine the optimal time block. So maybe describe a little bit about what's happening and what are some of the challenging aspects.
Yeah, I'm gonna answer your question as to technical, but then we should follow up with some of the other things that are tricky, because the technical, while really tricky, it's actually some of the behavioral side that turns out to be the really most difficult part about building this product. But from the technical perspective, it is the algorithm itself. I mean, optimizing across all schedules is, classically NP hard problem. If you try to optimize for the optimal case, you run out of compute pretty fast and you rack up some pretty insane AWS bills.
Right.
But more importantly, it takes too long to be effective. And so when we look at all of the information from the calendar, we actually have to look across different strategies to break out of local optimizations while still being speedy enough and fast enough to be able to process that, come out with an optimal solution, and then write it back to the calendar system. And, sometimes with a large organization that can take 5, 10, 15 minutes. And even that is, it's happening in the background. So to the user, it's autonomous and feels great. But for us, in that 15-minute time horizon, the calendar itself can shift.
Oh, right. Yeah.
So the longer, it takes to process that, the more you open yourself up to in a situation where you could do something that's not optimal for the user. And if we ever find something where we could create an error, we actually have to be quite conservative. And this goes a little bit more to the behavioral side, because the last thing we want to do is, one thing for us to improve the calendar, but we can't put you in a bad spot. We can't fail because otherwise it just, let's imagine you have a one-on-one with your manager, we move it to 9 p.m. You're going to uninstall us immediately. So from a technical perspective, it's a combination of the algorithmic complexity with kind of being constrained by how quickly you have to move in order to then write that in a way that's going to be effective.
Let's talk a little bit about that behavioral side of things that you brought up. Like, for example, okay, sure, the 9 p.m. thing, that makes sense. But also, let's just say the manager goes to the gym at 10 a.m. every single day. You can't block that time off. But then also the employee is, I don't know, picking up their kid at 4 p.m. or something. Like, is that kind of the challenge that you're talking about, or is there something different?
Yeah, it's a lot of things like that. I mean, the behavioral side really is that calendar. I mean, you can be distilled down to one core truth, which is that calendars are incredibly sensitive. It's very, very personal. This is how you're going to spend your time during the day. And it has a high degree of social capital associated with it. Where if, it's a meeting with your manager, a skip level with your manager's boss, the last thing you want to do is show up late to that or be in a bad place.
Right.
And therefore, we have to be pretty conservative about our approach, more conservative than we would like to be. There's often a rule around startups, which is, you just need to move fast and break things. And with us, while we try to move fast and iterate fast, and we do, that core algorithm and how we optimize, we always have to be very careful. And then one of the things that goes along with it is, because we are an intermediary layer now between you and your calendar, we often get blamed for things that we don't do. So we have a hard and fast rule that we will not automatically move a meeting on you. And this is something that we do. You opt into it. So it's not like we're moving things that you didn't tell us it's okay to move, but you opt into a meeting being on what we call flexible, which means that it can move within a specified period to make a better schedule for everyone. We have a hard rule that we will never do that under 20 hours in advance. And we get a lot of tickets and a lot of, frankly, some complaints in Slack groups and on social media. That's like, I can't believe Clockwise moved this meeting the morning of. It completely ruined my day. And, I get it, because events actually do move way more than people give it credit for without us involved. Your manager moves something or something cascades and it gets in a bad spot, and we can kind of soak up the blame for that. So it's the behavioral side of it has been very, very interesting.
That's very fascinating. And frankly, when you put it in those terms, I mean, I have it planned in my day of okay, 9 a.m. I have this, 10 a.m. I have this. Now all of a sudden something moves up. I'm like, Well, I could have used that time for something different or something like that. So it is very personal. Yeah.
Yeah, totally.
One aspect I think is pretty interesting is you have the true kind of PLG and enterprise motion combined into one, right? You have an individual that can go and pick up the product, use it, say this is the best thing since sliced bread. Let me use this now. But then you also have kind of the team's use case where I frankly think there's even more value when you kind of go from there. So describe how you balance those two motions, and maybe actually specifically, how do you get that individual who likes to use the product to be the champion to spread it out to the overall enterprise?
This is such a great question. I could probably take up the whole podcast on this. Long story short, I don't think that we've nailed this, but I do have a lot of observations and scar tissue along the way. So I think for those who are thinking about starting a business or maybe in a PLG business of their own, there are a couple traps here. One is to really have a PLG business where you're driving at least a venture-backed business where you're trying to get for some scale and some revenue scale. You really do have to have that team element, and it has to be integral to the product and real. I see a lot of companies who kind of come out with what effectively is an individual product, and then you try to tack on team. And sometimes that can work. Maybe you're in such a business critical element of an individual workflow that the team will end up paying for it, the business will end up paying for it. But a lot of the times, those are consumer or prosumer businesses masquerading as an enterprise business, because if you don't have that actual team value prop, it becomes a question of why would anybody pay for it on their corporate card? So that's one observation. I think to your point with Clockwise, we do have that, right? I mean, it's a product that gets meaningfully better as more of the team uses it. But then you have to bridge from that initial user experience of I'm using it as an individual, I'm getting value as an individual, which by the way, you have to have as a PLG product. Skipping directly to team is really tough too, because now you need to onboard 5, 10, 15 people at once, which is almost impossible. So you need to figure out that single player experience. And then transition them into bringing more of their team on. And so for us, in the early days, actually, we spent a lot of time building out the single player mode. So we have utilities like personal calendar sync, automatic color coding, automatic travel time. These are not necessarily core to our team value prop, but they're really great for individuals, and you can start using them right away. And that pulls you in and kind of gets you comfortable with the system. And then we educate you as to, hey, actually, if, Jane were on Clockwise, we could help move this meeting for you. And we also get the calendar service area to press out into those different avenues.
An individual sees the value, but obviously the main value comes from the teams in the sense of, when you're doing it across 5, 10, 100 people, that calendar Tetris is, such a pain in the ass. We've all been there.
Yep.
So clearly that value resonates immediately well with anybody who's had to do that. But how that doesn't really map to like what the individual is doing, right? Because the individual is trying to, like you said, bucket out the time to travel to an event and then travel back and stuff like that. That's very different than the kind of calendar Tetris opportunity for the whole team. So and I don't know if you have a motion for that or if you have some ideas on how that works, but I'm just curious, if there is some sort of migration method or something like that you have to.
There are a few different paths for different businesses, and I'll explain Clockwise, but it really is just one route. I mean, PLG is kind of a blanket term that pulls in a lot of stuff. For us, the individual value prop and the team value prop that we're selling to a centralized buyer on, to your point, they're not necessarily the same. And I think what's critical for us is for that the individual value prop incentivizes users to start using Clockwise, continue to use Clockwise, and spread it. And we need that spread actually to get to the centralized team value ROI for the buyer. Because for the buyer, what they're normally buying Clockwise for, and there are variations. We're kind of a generalized productivity platform. So some people buy for different use cases, but generally speaking, the ROI that you're really buying for is this is making my team's time more efficient such that I get more out of every individual contributor. And and so we're able to calculate that on the back of here's the amount of focus time, here's the amount of heads down time, here's the number of conflicts we resolve, here's the number of meetings we help schedule. I want to note there that I think what's really critical, you can overcome this hurdle, but it creates really weird distortions in your business if you have it, which is if that individual value prop runs contrary to the team value prop, that can be really, really tricky. For us, fortunately, for individuals, getting more heads down time, getting a better schedule is what they're signing up for. And then we're selling to the organization on, hey, everybody's both happier because they have a better schedule and they have more productive time in their schedule, such that this is a clear purchase for you because you're essentially getting more headcount at a very, very cheap price.
Is the value for let's say that team and enterprise use case driven pretty easily by the ROI of, hey, X amount of time saved across X amount of people and salary equals, Y amount of savings?
Kind of. So there's been a lot of ink spilled on this topic as well. And I'll actually plug Elena Verna, who writes a lot about this and was an advisor for us. She was at Miro for a while and Dropbox and others and SurveyMonkey. But the trick really is you have to package and price such that that individual value prop can punch through to a paid plan so that there's somebody who's financially incentivized to actually advocate for the purchase of the product on their own ROI. I would much rather sell Clockwise to a team or a group of individuals, but I've got to get somebody, because we're largely self-serve, I got to get somebody incentivized to go, we need this as a team. And so what often happens in the full motion is, we'll land, we'll start to expand a little bit. And then people, individuals and teams to some degree, I mean, we're good at, engineering managers or somebody who's maybe the first line of defense for the organization instead of a centralized buyer. They'll say, well, actually, this would be great if we had the team plan instead. So I'm going to put this on my personal corporate card, or I'm going to put this on our departmental card. And then that often will then give us the excuse to go hop into a discussion with the central buyer eventually for a wider rollout. And that conversation is a much more handheld, high touch conversation, whereas those earlier conversations need to be largely self-serve. There are asterisks on top of that. If we see something come in the front door that looks like, oh, that could be a huge opportunity for us, and we're getting some signal that they're growing really fast, we'll try to shortcut and talk to them directly before they raise it. But you do need to at some point make that transition from kind of that team-based advocate to the centralized buyer.
What's a do things that don't scale moment that you remember from early on the journey?
Oh man, too many. I have all the wrinkles to show it. Maybe we should have scaled some of these processes earlier. You know what? I'll actually I'll give an example of something we're doing right now. I don't think hopefully you never really scale out of doing things scrappy because you're always trying to push the product in different directions and keep building. And so right now we have that AI-based scheduling product. It's not a separate SKU or anything. It's part of Clockwise, but we are intensely developing right now. And so we have an alpha user base that's using it and testing it out as we're ironing out the bugs and working through some of the workflows. We have hundreds of users in this alpha and we're scaling it up to thousands and then eventually our whole user base. And right now we're still manually categorizing every interaction they have with that AI scheduler in order to deeply understand what's working, what's not working. And we of course, we have analytics baked in on top of this. Like, was this request successful? Did it error? What was the end result? But there's just if you want to learn fast, there's just nothing like actually watching a user use it. And so we try to look at every single flow that they interact with, and then we manually tabulate it in a spreadsheet and we go and we pop through. And it's not only great because there's a human level of intervention in that data set where they're actually subjectively characterizing some things that you'd lose, but it makes us all more empathetic because there's raw data is great and cannot be replaced, but there's just nothing like really feeling what the user is doing. That just doesn't come through in the data. And so it's insanely helpful, but we can't scale it. I mean, we'll have to sample at some point.
I'm always curious, when did that change for you in terms of, I mean, you're still watching users now, so you're going through the user workflow, but I'm sure with the early users, you probably were like, hey, I want to onboard them. I want to see how they're using.
Yeah.
Was that first 50, first 100, first, like, was there a number that you remember of like, I need to do this, and then finally I can kind of ease off because I know how the onboarding will work?
It depends a little bit on the dynamics of your business just to start. And so if you have, for example, something where, average account value is in the tens of thousands of dollars, you're going to do that for a really long time because every single one of those is really important. And so that early exploration and learning is going to transform into a high touch, kind of onboarding and enablement process. And I mentioned that at the start because we did it probably for about the first 50 to 100, but it was really important for us. We still observed it, but it was really important for us to transition into not handholding to see how the user experiences it. Because for our product, it's really got to be self-serve. And I think one of the big values of our product still today is that it's really easy to get up and running, even though it's a pretty complex and robust product. And that's just part of the business dynamic. I mean, we can't expend high touch resource on those. So probably first 50 to 100, but we didn't stop watching. We still watch them. I think it's really important to think about that with mature product areas and new product areas. So like Clockwise is not a multi-SKU product, but we're adding new features and functionality all the time. And so when we add a big new area, we'll go back to, really being involved with the user, going through that first process of really, hand-holding them through it, learning from them directly, then watching every single session, categorize it all. And eventually it'll get to a point of stability where we're mostly looking at the roll-up stats to make sure it's on track. And so, it's easy as you get into a company and past those first few stages where you're like, oh, thank God I don't have to do that anymore. And it's like, no, you
still got to do it.
Yeah. You have to remind yourself to do with everything. Yeah.
Yeah. It never stops. But I think everyone listening would like to hear your thoughts on time management, because I think you are probably as close to the expert on that topic as we can get to. And so across the customer base, what's the most common issue that you're seeing with time management?
This is going to sound a little bit corny, like a cop out, but it really is true. It's a lack of intentionality. I think it's really easy for everyone to kind of just get in the zone where you show up on a Monday and you just go with the flow. And a lot of the issues that people face with time management is it can be solved with just like 30 minutes at the start of the week or over the weekend or at the end of the last week to think about like, what do I need to do this week? In big buckets, not like here are my 20 tasks this week, but just like what are the most important things for me to juggle? Quick look at the calendar. Do I, broadly speaking, have the time to do that? And I think it's really important in assessing that to be very brutally honest with yourself, both in terms of what commitments do you have that you can't break. And so making sure that you're looking at not just work, but also personal. If you have to pick up the kids from school at 3:00 on Wednesday, like that's not magically going to go away just because it's not on your work calendar. And so the biggest one is just that intentionality of trying to plan out. But there are much, much deeper issues that arise from there.
That personal element is something I'm curious about, because I know, I mean, for me personally, during the workday, I like to block out a little bit of time for the gym because it just helps me recenter and frankly brings me back some energy from the early part of the day going into the second half. But how do you kind of think about those pauses or breaks or whatever? Like, should those be intentionally scheduled? And when you do them, do you find that overall teams are being more effective in terms of working together?
For sure. So, I mean, there's very good behavioral research that, back to back, especially on Zoom, actually can be really extremely draining. And by the time you're in, that fourth Zoom meeting, the amount of there that you have is reduced. You're just, you're drained. You're not paying as much attention. You're not getting as much out of it. And so structuring in breaks is really helpful. Just from a purely like showing up and being your best self standpoint. But then it depends a little bit on your function and what you're trying to get out of the day. And so I find that it's very helpful to try to stack like-minded meetings. So I have a dedicated day that's, for me, it's Thursday, where I'm meeting with my whole team we have our staff meeting in the afternoon. And that way, it's kind of a brutal day from a meeting standpoint. I do break in those breaks, 15, 20, 30 minutes here and there in order to have that pause because the drain effect is real on back-to-back meetings. But it's still kind of wall to wall. And that, despite it being wall to wall, it's very effective for me because I'm working in the same space the whole day, so to speak. Whereas on Wednesday, I like to bucket that out as much as possible. I have some meetings, but I like to bucket that out for more deep thinking, like work that's hard for me to get in flow for. And that's another thing that I think is really important as people are adding a little bit more intentionality is just be honest with yourself about, you don't have to like put this on a report card and give it to your manager. It's just you looking at your calendar. So be honest with yourself about what it takes you time to get into. For me, there are just some tasks where like they will continuously go to the bottom of my list because I don't want to do them.
Same, yeah.
And like if they require some deep thinking, I'll block that out for a Wednesday. I'll be like, look, I know that I need this whole morning because like out of this 2 hours, probably only 20 is going to be productive, but like it's going to take me a while to get in motion, like spin up and like figure it out. And so, yeah, I think that, bucketing things out where you're actually having the time to get in flow, to get in the space that you need to, and being cognizant of the meetings that are around it is really important.
Do you have data on context switching and its effect on, or I guess what's its effect, whether it's happiness or whether it's efficiency or effectiveness or whatever?
Yeah, there's this great, the researcher is, and I can't think of her right now, but this is actually back in, I think the early 2000s, did some behavioral research and coined the term attention residue, which I love. And basically what she found in her behavioral research is that when you, specifically as it relates to meetings, if you go into a specific context, and it doesn't have to be a meeting. It could just be like, you're thinking about one specific problem, but let's just use meetings for simplicity. You go to that meeting and it's about a specific topic. It's not just that you have that 30 minutes in the meeting. It's that after the meeting, it takes people on average 20 minutes to stop thinking about the meeting. And so you have this overflow. And even if you stack the meeting, like people go into a new meeting and you'll probably experience this if you notice it in your job where people come in, they're coming hot off of another meeting. They might have been thinking intensely about something and they're like just in a different place visually because you're still thinking about the to-dos. What do you have to resolve? What do you have to get through? What's up next? I think that's pretty intuitive for everyone once they observe it. But the other thing that happens with attention residue that's kind of weird is you'll get it before the meeting too. Like sometimes people can go right up to the meeting and then just switch. But for a lot of people, like, if you're working on a project or you're like putting a deck together and you like pause on a place that's really tough and you look at your schedule like, I have a meeting in 15 minutes. You're not necessarily going to power forward because you're like, I have this meeting in 15 minutes. I'm just going to check emails until the meeting. And so one of the things that we see with context switching in general and meetings specifically is that it's not just that block. There's actually a blast radius around it. And so if you're looking at your schedule and you're going, I have 30 minutes here and an hour there, that's not necessarily going to be solid time for every single project you need to tackle. Like, sure, that 30 minutes between meetings, maybe you fire off a couple of emails or you clean out your inbox, but you're not going to get up and running on something detailed in that amount of time because you're still got this attention residue from the last meeting and getting set up for the next one.
This is a problem that I personally have. So this is why I'm asking. But sometimes I'll be like, okay, I need to. Let's say it's a board meeting, right? Like I need to prep for this board meeting. I'd reviewed it the night before, but like let me go back through it another time, and so maybe I'll block off an hour before, right, to make sure I'm getting time to prepare for it. Yep. The only thing is, as you know, right, like Slack pops up and then, all of a sudden, like a pretty important email that, it could wait till later, but it kind of pops up. And so all of a sudden I find myself in work mode because I have that time and I've just been trained that if I have that time, like I should use it to be so-called effective and go and do that. So, how do you change that behaviorally? Because even if you block off on your time, unless I guess you restrict email access or something, like how do you go about making that change?
Yeah, so this is where we veer from, I think, things that you can structurally implement. I give generic advice. So like it's pretty personal. And that's why I think there's so many books on time management and how to manage your email and your schedule, because it's less like a one size fit all and it's more like a glove. It's like, this is the glove that works for me and it's really nice, but it might not work for you. And so you do see different strategies for this. I mean, some people really love to time block. They get hyper specific about, I need this period for this task specifically. Some people, really love the Pomodoro technique where, you're on for 20 minutes, you take a 5-minute break, and you repeat that and get comfortable with it. Some people really swear by blocking off the other distractions. And there are even some people that like to switch to a different physical space because there is something associative as humans that we have with a specific space and a specific task. Trying to elevate that to general advice, I would say experiment and then be really honest with yourself about what's working, what's not. Like, don't get, productivity guilt. That doesn't help, and again, you're not grading yourself or trying to send this to your manager. You're just trying to figure out what works for you. And so if you're finding with that board meeting, for example, where you regularly are blocking off that hour beforehand and it's not working for you, switch it up, and that's about it. It's just like, if you know that 1 hour isn't sufficient, try to move it, the day ahead of time and see what happens when you have an hour ahead of time and you give yourself a little bit more looseness to hit that space. And last thing, I could obviously talk about this forever, but last thing I'll note is that this is where the intentionality of reviewing your schedule on a weekly basis comes in handy. I am not personally a big fan of blocking off specific blocks with minutia because, the odds that I sit down at my desk and I do that one specific task at that one specific time are exceedingly slim. My day changes by the minute. My priorities might change because I got a different Slack message. But I think you do need to look at it a week and say, I have this board meeting coming up. It's this week. Mm-hmm. Are there enough blocks here, generally speaking, where I'm going to find that time to go, okay, I burned down the email, I did the Slack messages, I guess I'll read the board materials.
That makes sense. And frankly, I think you're right. We seem to constantly have these shifting priorities, but that intentionality, I think, is the one thing I'm taking away from this is almost, and this is an aspect I want to ask you about, but how do you do an effective calendar audit, right? Like, do you need to be, in terms of that intentionality, being like, this week I want to spend 20% of my time doing X task and 30% of my time doing Y task, and then kind of count those times and figure it out? Or what's the most effective way to really do this?
Well, I'll address the calendar audit, but I'll give everybody in the audience a quick tip to try, which I personally found very effective. I do a weekly kind of look ahead at my schedule. I usually do it on Sundays just because it gets me out of the work week and I can think about it clearly, but you could do it Monday morning or Friday. And I list out the top 3 to 5 priorities I have that week. And so these are big bucket items. They're not necessarily at a granular level, but I do that in concert of looking at my schedule. And then the tip that I have for everyone is write those out in an email. What are your top 3 to 5? And then send that email to your team. And then next week at the same time, send a follow-up email that's, here's what I got done on those this past week, and here's what my priorities are for this week. And the reason that I mention this tip is because often it's the process of holding ourselves accountable to being intentional that gets lost. It's really easy for me to say on a podcast, like, be more intentional about your time management. It's like, okay, great, Matt, thanks, deep advice. But if you're actually sending that to people as like, here are my priorities, and you're checking it week over week, it becomes a habit and a routine because you feel some accountability to the people you're sending it out to. And I'll give you, the dirty secret about all this is, like, most of the people that you send it to, like, it might be helpful. For my team, it's helpful for them to see what my priorities are. So there is actually a communication aspect of this that's really helpful. But it doesn't really matter. Like, it's really for you. Because, like, now you're reviewing week over week. Did I actually do those things? And that's where you can make the adjustment based on your schedule and based on what happened. You go, oh, I didn't get to this. Why is that? Like, am I trying to list too many things? Did I not have enough time? Is this something that just felt kind of crappy and I didn't want to do it? Was it actually not a priority and I was just kind of buffing myself up to think it was a priority? And that's the part that's really important, because if you do that week over week over week over week over week, you'll surprise yourself. You just get way better with estimating out, like, what do you really need in order to hit your goals for the week? I'll pause there, but I can talk about calendar audits too if you want.
Yeah, well, I think that's a frankly a useful tip for even because calendar audit I think is a loaded term, like you said, and versus that I think makes a ton of sense and something everyone could work into their day. But one thing I have to ask you about is there's been some research that there are certain people that are morning people and there's certain people that are evening people, right?
Yep.
And circadian clocks and all that sort of stuff. And so in terms of managing those folks effectively, is this something that you recommend teams should be having discussions around of like, hey, do you normally work better at, I know, for example, some engineers that love to work from the hours of like 8 till midnight and that's their most productive time. And so like
Yeah.
you could actually have them, sure, they got to join some meetings here or there or whatever, but you could have them, kind of do something else during the day as long as they could go and spend that time when they're most productive at night. So how do you think about managing that within teams?
Yeah, so I think it's fantastic for teams to have conversations about how they want to organize themselves. And I really mean team there. It's not a euphemism for company or department, because it really works best when you're like 5, 10 people or even smaller, frankly, because the fewer people that you have to coordinate there, the more precise you can get about what works for everyone. As that group expands, I mean, network connections are exponential. So the jump from 5 to 10 isn't a doubling; it's a whatever that is.
Right, because you have to, yeah, there's more, yeah.
And so if you can sit down as a team and look at what works for everyone, you can start to map out with more intentionality the timing. And one of the nice things is that it turns out that most, not all your meetings, but usually about 50%, sometimes as high as 70% of your meetings are driven by a core set of people that you interact with the most. And so if you can all get on the same page, it's great. Now, what I will say is that that's not always possible. Really important to have that conversation, but it might not always be possible to do that. And so a backup is, if it's not possible to coordinate that all, try to maybe block out certain periods where you don't want to be intervened with. And so classic examples like a no meeting Wednesday, no meeting Friday, these types of things. You can, if you have a team and you have 5 to 10 people, you can get a little bit more specific about that and be like, hey, Tuesday afternoons, no meetings. Thursday afternoons, no meetings. Everything else, feel free to do it, but we're going to block those times off. And it's just about try to set some boundaries and some alignment on your team on what works and also what the expectations are. If I'm an engineer and my manager knows that I work best in the evenings and I prefer not to meet in the morning, that doesn't necessarily mean that I'll never get a meeting in the morning. But at least you have some communication about expectations and patterns that person can be aware in the future.
So one thing I'm very curious about the team has thought about, and I would love to read, is like some sort of state of time report from the Clockwise team. But basically, the reason I'm asking that is you get to see data across some of the most impressive teams. I mean, Netflix, Atlassian, like just ridiculously productive, amazing teams that you've seen. And so I'm just curious, like across the whole customer base, when you look at the data that you have, what's the most interesting thing that you see? Like, is it time spent on certain meetings? Is it like, I mean, I don't even want to put things in your mouth. What's interesting?
So I'll give a quick plug, which is that we do have the software engineering benchmark report. Now we published that about a year ago, but it's ripe with little tidbits like this, and some super interesting stuff. And we're going to be refreshing it. So if you find it, you'll be able to stay tuned for the update. There are a couple of things in here that are not surprising. And so, 80% of the team thinks that, having heads down time helps finish project faster, makes them more productive. But I think one of the things that's surprising is that the average software engineer, and so keep in mind, we have a cross section of amazing companies, really best in breed. And the average software engineer spends about half their time in heads down focused time. And so that may sound small, but I actually think I was surprised that it was as high as it was, because that roughly 20 hours a week, that's heads down, 2+ hour blocks of time where you get to go and focus on code. Now we do see best of breed, like can get that up to around 30 hours with intentionality, because for IC software engineers, they should be spending most of their time heads down actually able to do what they want to do, which is ship code. And then there are a few other things that are, again, not incredibly surprising, but as companies grow, the coordination tax among meetings grows. At the onset of the pandemic, we saw a huge bump in the number of meetings. And I think that's just because people were trying to replace in-office work with on-Zoom work. And then engineers are just more productive when they have more heads downtime, and engineering managers see revenue impact from that.
That is a very cool report, and I'm looking forward to reading it. And in general, if you even blow it out amongst all the knowledge workers, I think there'll be some really cool stuff. It's like the Okta state of work sort of thing. I think you guys could do that for the state of time or something. So
one of the other things that I'll add on here, because we've looked into other aspects to just kind of office work generally, and we're thinking about producing a report. It helps to be specialized a little bit so we can dive on insights, but it would be fun to do that. And this may or may not be surprising, but the variance in terms of how companies are using their time in the aggregate, even at the same size and number of employees, is just kind of wild. And it goes to show how much culture is an influence. Like, companies just get into a groove of doing what they do and the processes that they have. And I think one of my observations is that as you grow as a company, it's really important to, at specific junctures, reevaluate and kind of blow stuff up. And we've seen a few examples of that recently with Shopify.
Oh yeah, they canceled all the meetings or something, right?
Yep. And I think it's just helpful to kind of clean the slate every once in a while and reevaluate where you can get to, because there's just cruft that builds up, and some of it is just the cruft of the calendar, but also some of it is cruft of cultural. Like, this is the way we do things. We're just going to keep doing it this way, and there's no reason that one 5,000 person company should be way less productive than another 5,000 person company, just in terms of their calendar utilization. And I think any company can get there with a little bit more focus and work.
Well, you talked about the AI scheduler coming up, but what's some final things that you hope the listeners would take away from this podcast and just kind of get away from, whether it's time management or anything like that?
Well, I mean, the AI scheduler and kind of our focus going forward on AI, I think, is going to be a really, really exciting place to watch. I mean, kind of goes without saying, if you're in software right now, you're spending a lot of time watching AI companies. But one of the things that we've seen, and I would pattern match, I'd be interested in your perspective here as an investor, but that companies that have a large specialized data set to work with already are at a huge advantage to delivering AI-based products relative to startups. Now, there's like kind of a nice meaty middle there, I think, where if you're a huge incumbent, it may be a little bit difficult to turn the ship. But we've, built we spent almost 7 years building out what I would argue is the world's most advanced scheduling engine, because we have to automatically move meetings. It's quite difficult. There's a lot going on under the hood. And then to have the advent all of a sudden of LLMs that can reason about a user's intent, that's a huge, huge, exciting breakthrough for us. And mirroring those two, I think, is going to be incredibly interesting.
I mean, I think you have some of the most interesting data out there in terms of productivity and what's everyone's most precious resource, which is time, which leads to salary and efficiency. So I'm very excited. I think AI schedulers is obviously something you guys are going to ship soon, but I'm sure you have a lot of other stuff up your sleeve.
Well, and by the way, I think one thing that this audience might appreciate too is, like, we actually don't use any of that data to train models. We don't use it to fine tune models. We're actually not, there's a pretty hard boundary between our customer data and any LLM. And I think initially when a lot of these models came out, that's immediately where people's heads went. And frankly, where IT security went is like, right. Hey, don't let my data go to the model. But what we've done, and it's actually not out of a security privacy stance, it's out of a genuine how we want to build the product stance, is that the LM can be hugely advantageous for interpreting the user's request and intent, and still allowing our systems to do all the primary operating on user calendar and data. And so even if the LM isn't specialized, isn't informed, isn't trained by user data, it can be really impactful to open that up as a way for the user to communicate more fluidly and effectively, and then to augment some of those requests with a higher degree of intelligence under the hood so we can move faster for the user. It's so fascinating to build on these days. It kind of takes me back to the 90s when I was building on the early web, and like it just like your eyes pop open with all the possibilities because you got this new weird technology in front of you.
It's an incredible time to build. So, but Matt, thank you so much for the time and coming on, sharing your insights. Is there anything you'd specifically like to call out that's coming up, whether it's the release of the AI schedule or anything else for the company?
Yes. Get clockwise.com/AI. Go there, sign up on the wait list, join us in building this thing. We'd love to have you. And thanks so much for having me. This was a lot of fun.
Awesome.